So what I do is that I do exactly that. So I find out something, and I go to press releases, or I might Google something to find out if they're a senior person and they're a guru, if you like, in their field. I'll be looking for where they've spoken at a conference and take something from what they said. And I call this a valid business reason or a valid listening reason for making the call. And I take that, if you like, and that's the distillation of my research. I take that to the CEO's secretary, and I say, I'm calling you about, and I state this thing. It's your European expansion strategy. It's your second round of venture capitalist funding, whatever it is, and say who's the right person to speak to. And at that point, they will point me in the right direction. They'll say it's X, Mr. or Mrs., whoever it is, and here's their contact details, and here, or they will point me in the direction of their PA. Does anybody follow a similar process? Yep? Okay. And then what I do, quite differently, and I'd be interested to sort of compare notes on this, is that what I discovered while I was doing this is that when I was working for, just out of interest, anybody remember Hoskins? Remember Hoskins Project Systems Division? Yeah, great, okay. So I used to work for them, and my job day in, day out was to kind of bash on these doors. And what I did, what you'll know is that all the metrics of sales and marketing is around meetings, yes? Salespeople are constantly pressurized. Go get those meetings, yeah? And what I found was that I was sending people all over the country, and the meetings could be well qualified, well, kind of well qualified, but they'd come back and say, well, the opportunity's next year. Because the sales director or the marketing director at the time had said, go build relationships. Even if there's no requirement, go build relationships. So what we thought might be a better idea is if we set up telephone meetings. And by that I mean asking for a 10, 15 minute, it was kind of 10, 15 minutes to start with, and then now what I do is 15, 20 minutes. And interestingly enough, the hit rate went up. But the flip side for those of you who are saying, let me just get a poll of hands here because this will be interesting. How many of you prefer to go to face-to-face meetings rather than? Okay, right. So there's a visual component. So you need to see people, yeah, to feel that you're completely engaging, and we'll cover how to some of that later on. So by asking for these telephone meetings, what I found is that the close rate went up, but also we were able to qualify, if you like, the key points within those 10 or 15 minutes. And then when the salesperson went out to effectively the first meeting, they would come back and say, it's like this is like a second meeting, okay? Now, just the interesting for the model here is that what I discovered later, are you familiar with the work of Professor Robert Cialdini? Yeah, Power of Persuasion and Influence. Oh, look at his stuff, it's good stuff. Professor Robert Cialdini, C-I-A-L-D-I-N-I. He says that if you ask someone for a little bit of something first, if you go back to them and ask them a second time, they're more likely to give you a bigger chunk than if you'd asked for a bigger chunk in the first place. Does that make sense? Yeah. So what I discovered was that by asking for 15 minutes, when I went to book the call, they would give 30 minutes, in some cases an hour. So effectively, we had a meeting on the phone. Yeah? Okay. So there were two routes to do this. One is to go to the decision maker directly, and the other was to do it via the PA. Yep. Okay. Now I'll cover the decision maker, and I'll do the PA bit later on. So the bit that's come out of a lot of your questions is, how do I start this conversation when they're getting hundreds of these calls? Yeah? That's the question. You agree? Is that kind of... what do I say? What's the hook? How do I get them engaged? How do I differentiate? Now, I believe that by doing that little bit of research, but there's a second bit here, is ensuring that that research, and again, this is all blindingly obvious to people like yourselves, is that that research, that valid business reason or listening reason, links back to what you want to promote or sell. Yeah? There is a synergy, yes. So if they get a second round of funding, if they're expanding into Europe, that your skill set or your project set supports that. Yeah? Okay. But that still doesn't stop the rejection. So where's the magic here? Well, I believe it's all about your world, my world, yeah? And how can I assess where your world is when I call you? I can assess it through your voice tone, yeah? That is very often missed because there is so much anxiety to present what it is that you want to say in the first place. Yeah? But if you take a moment, or your teams take a moment, to actually process that tonal information, you can then acknowledge that, what that information is saying. Yeah? Are you with me? Am I? Yeah, okay. So what I often do, because the presupposition is that every phone call is an interruption, would you agree with that? Yeah? Is that very often the tone is, yes, Smithson here, yes, how can I help you? It's that sort of tone. And if it's that sort of tone, then some form of introductory pitch about something is just going to fall completely flat. So what I do, and even if the tone is a friendly one, I say, you won't want to speak to me now. Now is not going to be a good time. And we have this laugh. There is always some form of laughter or, yeah, you're absolutely right, I've got my head in a massive spreadsheet here. And at that point I say, could I call you back? Could we find a time to call back? And by doing that, I'm reflecting the world back to the person who I'm trying to connect with. And interestingly, in a number of the questions, there was this thing about how do I grab their attention? How do I say what I have to say? How can I get it all out? Yeah, there's this kind of anxiety. But if there's that confidence that they don't want to speak to you now, that's their world, and you reflect that, then the hit rate is significantly higher. Because the salesperson, or indeed yourselves if you're networking, is that you're reflecting back that now is not a good time. Yeah. So how do I get to that point? I think this is the interesting thing. Because we come back to feeling, and how do I plan this? How many of you actually plan calls? Brilliant. Okay, so that's great. And let me just tell you how I do it, because I think it'd be interesting, maybe in the Q&A, to compare notes. Is what I do is, and be interested if you're familiar with this exercise. This exercise which is called perceptual positions, where you've got 3 chairs, yeah? And you take the first chair, and you sit down, and you write down all the outcomes that you want from the call, yeah, as you. And then you stand up, and from want of a better word, you kind of shake off your world, and you sit down in the chair of the person you're going to call. And ask yourself the question, if I was listening to me, how would I respond? So you're them, hearing it through their ears, not through yours, and write down your perception. Yeah? and then stand up and shake off their world and sit down in this chair, and I'll move across so you can see me, is the observer chair, or what I like to call wise owl. So you're observing the potential dynamic that's going to happen between you and the person you wish to engage with. Yeah? How many of you work with conflict situations? Yeah? Okay. So this is an excellent exercise if you want to get a different perspective on a situation. And just to throw in something that's related also to the work that I do, is that, I don't know if you read in my biography, but 3 years ago I had a stroke. As you can see, I made a remarkable recovery. And one of the things I do now is that I speak at medical conferences and I train health professionals about how to get a sense of what it's like to be a patient recovering from a severe health setback. And I use this exercise. So if you have any sort of skepticism about it, it is very powerful. If there's anybody here who thinks I'm completely barking mad, does anybody record calls? Yeah. So if you record your calls, you'll actually get those 3 positions. Yeah. You can listen to the call through your work, through your ears, if you like, through your perspective. You can listen to the call through the client's perspective, and of course you can take the observer position. And for those of you who don't record your calls, do record your calls, because they're the most brutal coach. They will give you the most fantastic feedback on the impact that you're making as you're doing your calls, and also they're great note takers. So it's interesting to capture some of the stuff that when we're anxious to say something that we want to get over, the machine, of course, will capture